I've just been through some shit. Oh, look at this! A well-respected psychology professor from Cornell published a paper. It's about psychic abilities. And whoa, it looks like he's saying they do exist. This should be fun.
A few moments later.
What am I reading?
A few moments later.
Oh my God.
A few moments later.
This could be the most amazing discovery in human history. The year was 2011, and Professor Emeritus Daryl J. Bem of Cornell University dropped a bombshell on the entire scientific community, the rippling effects of which still persist to this day. He had just announced to the world that psychic abilities are real. Yep, according to him, extrasensory perception actually exists. But that's not even the craziest part. He also found that the average person has access to these abilities. As you can imagine, people were overjoyed to hear this news. After all, who doesn't want superpowers, right? However, his findings didn't come easily. Through blood, sweat, and tears, Bem labored for years to collect evidence. In the end, it came as the result of many painstaking studies that spanned a decade. It was his life's work, and finally, when he had all the evidence he needed, he published it. On the surface, everything looked legit, but he was hiding something sinister, which involved the method he used to obtain this evidence. But before we get into what he found, and his dark means of obtaining it, let's take things back to the beginning. In the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, Daryl J. Bem was a well-respected psychologist specializing in social psychology. He authored the Intro to Psychology book used to teach undergraduates at universities worldwide, published an overwhelming amount of research in prestigious journals, and was a distinguished professor, teaching at some of the most elite universities. If you've studied the subject or are interested in the field, you've definitely heard of him. He's a psychology superstar. But while he was deeply involved in social psychology, in the late 1980s, he developed an obsession with Psi. And Psi is the most controversial topic in all of psychology for good reason. Have you ever felt such a strong connection to someone that you knew exactly what they were thinking? This phenomenon is known as telepathy, and it's one of several psychic abilities referred to collectively as Psi. And a substantial portion of the population believes these abilities exist, despite the lack of scientific evidence. The scientific community is much more skeptical, with many failed attempts to prove paranormal phenomena over the years. But for Bem, that didn't matter. He had one goal: prove the skeptics wrong. And he was about to go to some very extreme lengths to do it. So he got to work. And for the better part of a decade, he conducted experiments using Cornell students as test subjects. After many years of trials, in 2011, he finally published his work in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. Through 9 carefully conducted experiments, he showed that the psi abilities of precognition and premonition are abundant in the population, and that there is a strong correlation between these abilities and extroverts. Now, before you go out auditioning for a role in the next Marvel movie, the story doesn't end here. Bem's paper itself is quite convincing. Each experiment is described in great detail, down to the algorithms used to generate random or pseudo-random distributions. The experiments themselves are quite simple. Each participant enters a room with a computer, is allowed to relax for some time, and then perform some remedial task, such as guessing whether a picture will be behind a panel on the left or right of the screen. The sample sizes of the experiments were about 100 students each, which is adequate for significant results. And the results themselves were unquestionably conclusive, with many outperforming the norm by over 4 standard deviations. This is a feat which won't happen by chance, but 1 in 10,000 times. And with the paper's acceptance in a premier peer-reviewed journal, the results were breathtaking. Could it be that the average human exhibits just a little bit of ESP? Of course, other psychologists were skeptical, but Bem was prepared for a fight. He even addressed the skeptics in his paper by providing answers to some of the most obvious concerns. Additionally, he gave a call to action for other researchers to reproduce his work. And so, a quest began. Hundreds of psychologists from around the world got to work and duplicated his experiments. They followed his methods exactly, but no matter how hard they tried, none were able to reproduce Bem's results. Not one. In fact, quite the opposite occurred. Anyone who attempted the same experiments found that their participants had no ability whatsoever to predict the future or any other psychic abilities. What's going on? If his evidence was so solid, surely it could be replicated, if only a little. Turns out, Daryl Bem may not have been the honorable researcher everyone believed he was. You see, academia is a cutthroat business. Hundreds of papers are submitted to a journal, but only a handful are selected for publication. And it's no secret that the review board favors submissions from renowned authors. Moreover, papers that have groundbreaking new results, or those offering a bit of dramatic flair, are preferable to those with more mundane qualities. In other words, they're biased about what's published. So, Bem was already a well-respected author at the time, and if the paper was to be believed, it would certainly pique the interest of any reader. And thus, it was published. The general public rejoiced at the notion that Psi exists, and skeptics began to have doubts about the foundations of science. But if the results of Bem's experiments demonstrated this Psi phenomenon beyond a reasonable doubt, why could no one else find even a small shred of evidence? To answer this question, we need to understand Bem's character and his true intentions for these experiments. Fortunately, the latter requires no speculation, as he was quite vocal about his desires for the field of parapsychology. He was a Psi fanatic, and everyone knew it. In an article published in Slate magazine, Bem is quoted as saying, "I gathered data to show how my point would be made. I used data as a point of persuasion." This sounds a whole lot like data fabrication, which is a serious offense in the scientific community. Any paper without experimental results wouldn't see the light of day. But if those results are cherry-picked to prove a point, that goes against everything science stands for. It's a major issue, and only someone with a name and reputation as renowned as Bem could even think about getting away with it. To this day, no one really knows what happened during Bem's experiments. A popular theory is that Bem used a technique called p-hacking to produce data that supported his claims. Others believe the data was cherry-picked from a much larger sample size. Either way, this seems like a serious breach of ethics. So why would a well-respected researcher do something like this? It didn't take long for Bem to reveal his true character. A year later, Chris French, a psychology professor from the University of London, attempted to reproduce Bem's results. With the expected outcome, no evidence whatsoever of Psi abilities. Still, he wrote up his findings and submitted the work to several journals, intending to shed new light on the hot topic of parapsychology. However, all of his publications were rejected. Many of the rejections cited the reason We don't publish replications. But one journal in particular, the British Journal of Psychology, caught his attention, as one of the referee's comments seemed to dismiss the work entirely. You guessed it. That referee was none other than Daryl J. Bem. Bem's original call to have others reproduce his work was a backhanded request. If others could duplicate his results, he would be happy to praise them and help spread the joy of Psi. Those who couldn't duplicate his work were gatekept from presenting their findings. He used his power to silence those with opposing evidence. But when you do some digging into his past, it becomes clear why he'd do such a thing. Bem always wanted to believe in Psi abilities. Since the 1990s, he has been actively studying and publishing papers that support a belief in the paranormal. In 1994, he published a review of some Psi literature, much coming from a professor Carl Sargent of Cambridge. Sargent's experiments were controversial in methodology to the point where a colleague said he had flat out cheated on his data collection after observing his work for some time. I guess this trade secret has been passed on to the next generation. So, Bem's work, falsified. Psychic abilities still have no reasonable evidence. Physics is saved. For now. But one good thing did come out of this catastrophe. And that's a movement known in the scientific community as the Replication Crisis. I know, the name doesn't fill me with a lot of confidence either. At its core, the movement is a growing uneasiness in the scientific community centered around reproducing or replicating the results of older studies. And this has brought about more robust experimental practices to the field of psychology. It's even opened the doors to a completely new field of study. Also, the replication crisis is not limited to psychology and aims to help the entire scientific community. While it didn't develop directly from Bem's controversial experiment, looking at a timeline of events, it's clear this was a major contributing factor. There you have it. I'm ready to take a nice, long walk without worrying about whether the person across the street staring at me is reading my mind. They aren't. I'm sure of it.